and welcome to the Film Academy Day at the BFI London Film Festival 2020. My name is Alex and I'm the Film Academy Festival and Events producer. Today's panel is inspired by a short film in the Generation Now program. The short film is called Follow Me, and it is available to watch for free on the BFI player and the Film Academy Facebook channel for the duration of the festival. So through Sunday, the 18th of September. Please do give it a watch if you haven't seen it yet. It's amazing. Our panel today will be hosted by Naomi de Sousa, who is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and writer, whose work addresses history, spatial politics, and identity. Her documentaries include The Architecture of Violence, Angola, Birth of a Movement, and Hacking Madrid. And she's a filmmaker on the 2016 Signaya project, which won a Peabody Award in 2017. And we are really excited to have Anna host this session. She will introduce you to all the panelists. But just before I hand over to Anna, I just wanted to tell you a few housekeeping things. First of all, we have our BFI Film Academy team working behind the scenes today. My colleague Noel will be managing the chat box. So if you have any questions for our team, so questions about the BFI, about Film Academy, our courses, questions about London Film Festival or our upcoming future film festival, then please ask those questions of Noel in the chat box. However, if you have any questions for our panelists, then please put them in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screens. So my colleague Winnie is managing the Q&A box and we'll be devoting the last 15 minutes of the session to your questions, but you can get asking now. I would like to thank our partners. All BFI education events are supported by the Reuben Foundation. We have our funding contributors, Old Possum's Practical Trust, and our competition partner, LaCie, who will be giving away a hard drive at the end of the event today. So just like we do for our monthly labs events, we'll be awarding the best question asked. So get your thinking caps on, start putting those questions in the Q&A box, and make sure that you're putting down, that you have your full names written out when you're asking those questions so that we know who we are awarding our prize to. For all of you who registered to take part in this competition, when you were registering for the event, we'll be announcing the winner at the very end of the event. So after the Q&A session, make sure you stick around. We'll be announcing the winner live. And if you're not around to claim your prize, we'll move on to calling the next name. So it's really, really important that you stay online. I also wanted to let you know that we've taken your feedback on board about wanting to network with each other more as part of our sessions. And until we can safely host you back at the BFI South Bank for some drinks in the Blue Room, we've started a Facebook networking group for you. And Noel will shortly post a link to it in the chat box. But feel free to join and share your portfolios, your contacts, your profiles with each other and start talking. And as the very, very final thing for me, I wanted to let you know that the session today is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the BFI YouTube channel after the festival. And now I'll hand over to Anna. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion on activism in film. I'm going to start off by introducing our panel to you in alphabetical order, and perhaps our panel can switch themselves on. Alaa Alsaraji is a project manager at Maslaha's Muslim Girls Fence project, delivering workshops in schools and communities. She's a graduate of the interdisciplinary design course at Goldsmiths, University of London, where she specialised in service design. In her final project, After the Welcome, she investigated the issues faced by newly arrived refugees and asylum seekers in Austria, challenging the notion of integration and developing practical alternatives using cultural production as a tool. She's a member of the Khida Collective, a multidisciplinary artist collective creating platforms and spaces for young Muslim creatives, where she's heavily involved in the visual production of the biannual Khida zine. Anna Nørager graduated in 2018 from the Danish School of Journalism as a TV director. After working in the industry in Denmark for a couple of years, she decided to follow the path of documentary filmmaking internationally. She's now a second-year MA Directing documentary student at the National Film and Television School. As a director, Anna is drawn to relatable stories in strange circumstances, stories that create a bigger picture and challenge our understanding and perspective of the world. Raheel Mohammed is the director and founder of Maslaha, an organisation which creates long-term interventions tackling inequalities in areas such as health, education, gender inequality, the criminal justice system, and negative public narratives. Raheel has been named as one of Britain's 50 new radicals by The Observer and Nesta. Raheel is the creator, writer, and co-host of podcast The Future is Muslim. He's also the co-author of Time to End the Silence, a review of the systematic racism Muslims face in the prison system, and he's currently working on further research and practical interventions in this area. He's researched, written and curated 2 international exhibitions and sits on an advisory board to the Ministry of Justice, looking at the disproportionate number of young Muslim men in the criminal justice system. And finally, Sarah. Sarah Moses is the founder and CEO of Together Films, a leading marketing, distribution and data company based in London, serving clients worldwide. Sarah is a leading expert in the field of impact distribution campaigns, having worked on recent titles including For Sama, helping to launch the Action for Sama campaign, The Tale, HBO Sundance 2018, and Unrest, which was Oscar shortlisted and was in Sundance 2017. Sarah is currently advising the teams behind Coded Bias and The Eighth to drive audience engagement and impact. Sarah is the host of the Digital Perspectives webinar series, launched during lockdown to support the film industry to pivot to online engagement, and recently launched the Digital Power webinar in partnership with the Centre for Media and Social Impact, supported by the Perspective Fund. So welcome to everybody. We're going to have about an hour now for discussion, and there's time for questions, as Alex mentioned, so do keep your questions coming whilst we're talking. So we're going to be talking today about activism and film. I think this is a really important time for us to be thinking about how film can engage with urgent social and political issues, like Anna's been doing with her film. So Anna, I wanted to start with you. I think one of the great things about your film is that you've managed to make it with just basically Skype conversations and social media feeds. And in terms of sort of activist film, you show that you can make a film with very few resources. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like in terms of your process? What do you think you learned about activist filmmaking, making this film?
I think, first of all, I don't go into the project thinking this is going to be an activism film, but this is going to be a film that gives an insight to something that happens to be activism, because this is about how these women use social media to challenge norms and traditions. And I think the whole process of the film started as a research process, because I knew that I wanted to do films in Iraq, and I knew that I wanted to do something about what these women are fighting for and what they're fighting against, but I couldn't go at that moment. So I started to research, and I got to know a lot of women, and I reached out to them, and then I just kind of like started the film as a research process, but filming what I was researching. And throughout that process, the revolution started in Baghdad, and through following these women, I realized that suddenly my feed was filled with what was happening on the streets of Baghdad, and it was a completely different insight to what was going on than what I was hearing in the news. So I started just collecting all that material, and yeah, that
this practical. Sorry to interrupt. I just thought I wanted to bring you back to the practical, more than about, you know, how did you make it? How did you? Because that's one of the things I think for when you're starting out making films, it can feel very intimidating. Like, you know, how do I do this? You know, I don't have like a big expensive camera, or maybe you don't have a crew at all. I mean, I don't know if you had any kind of crew. Did you make it entirely by yourself?
Well, do you want me to answer now, or do you have more?
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I made it by myself, but obviously I have a crew of a producer and an editor and a production manager. But my crew is mainly for the post-production of the film. The whole like making of the film is me and the producer and the production manager. And in a project like this, where everything happens on screen and on social media, there is a lot of things you have to go through in terms of rights, which has like been a massive amount of work that I could have never done on my own. But the whole like talking to the women and getting to know them and filming it on my computer screen and my phone, that's all something I did by myself.
Great. Raheel, you run an organization that has used film quite a lot. I mean, I remember when our paths first crossed, you were using film a long time ago in communities. Could you talk maybe a little bit about why film is a useful tool for the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, I think film has so many different purposes depending on the kind of project you want to do. So I think right now, like as you said, Anna, like right now in this particular moment in history, I think film is, the unofficial curriculum of social history, because we have a government that is basically saying you're not allowed to teach anti-capitalist ideas in schools, for instance. So I think like now more than ever, it's about hearing the stuff. It's hearing about truths and stories that aren't in accepted and kind of palatable textbooks or programs. And so there's a kind of, and I think it's really relevant right now as well, because there's Steve McQueen's film about the Mangrove restaurant that's coming out. I think it's out this month, but it's out in the BBC November, which charts the kind of the state racism, the institutional racism of the police force against the kind of Jamaican community around this restaurant, and how they took on the state. Now that isn't a story that's kind of told, you're not taught that in school, but the fact that Stephen McQueen is kind of like reigniting that memory, bringing that back to a mainstream audience is really important. But I think film can also like really help to tackle, I think, things like, this is World Mental Health Day today. So, we've created a resource called Talking from the Heart. And it basically just widened the language of how you talk about depression and anxiety for communities who aren't always served best by, the medical profession. So we worked with communities to script up ideas around what depression and anxiety looks like, how it can express itself, what some of the solutions can be. And then that film became something that was used by like NHS trusts, by Mind across the country, won an international award, which was cool. But it only worked because we were working with those communities. They were a part of every single part of the process. And it was interesting because I think the filmmakers weren't from a Somali, Pakistani or Bangladeshi background. So the filmmakers almost had to kind of take almost like a back seat in a way. They had to kind of give up power and let the kind of communities kind of drive how you kind of tackle really practically something like, mental health.
And what do you think, what does that kind of, I'm interested about in that participative process, isn't it? Where people are also making the film, and do you want to talk a little bit more about that before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always about, so I'm just going to read, there's Professor Singh says, she's got this kind of like almost manifesto about why do you want to write something. And so there's a couple of points, but some of them are, what is your personal, emotional, psychological, ethical investment in writing it? This could be film, right? Can someone else tell this story better? Is it someone else's story to tell? And I think for me, those are a couple of the points around, we're talking about different communities' mental health. So they are the closest to what that means. And once you it's almost like allowing people the opportunity to be creative and to have a public voice. People will take that up. But it's the fact that those communities aren't given the opportunity, that that is the problem in the first place. And I think, you know, again, like going on about Steve McQueen, but Steve McQueen says, you know, we've probably lost 2 generations of filmmakers who weren't given that opportunity. You know, the kind of black Marlon Brandos are like working in IT or you know, that's, and I think that's really sad. But it's up to us to kind of, it's up to people to give up power as well in space.
I want to come back to that, I think, maybe in a little bit, but maybe Alaa, you could talk a little bit then about your work with Muslim girls, fence and film in community, like leading off what Raheel was saying.
Yeah, so Muslim Girls Fence is the project that's run by Maslaha and British Fencing, and our aim is to create safe spaces for Muslim women and girls to physically and creatively express themselves. So we'll have like physical activity sessions where we kind of mainly focus on fencing, and then creative workshops where we use the discussions to kind of talk about issues like identity, racism, Islamophobia, kind of the day-to-day experiences that the girls we work with experience themselves. And last year we had the really, really amazing opportunity to collaborate with Shuet Films, which is kind of like a couple filmmaking organization, and it was a really, really interesting project. So we collaborated to create a short documentary following the journey of the girls who took part in the program in a school in West London that we worked with. And it was really amazing because the filmmakers really allowed us as sort of people on the ground who are actually doing the work, working directly with the girls, to really input and have not just input, actually have creative control as well. And I think that was really, really important for us, and you can kind of see it in the outcome. The documentary is called Nobody's Metaphor. It's really kind of an authentic and powerful capturing of what the girls kind of experience and what they want to share. And I think for us, it was really the really important thing was that we were kind of fully involved. So it wasn't a case of filmmakers coming in, filming, and then going off editing, and maybe we'll have a little bit of a back and forth. It was actually a conversation and a negotiation almost throughout. So even really practical things like we could come into the classroom and say, well, the best thing for the film would be to have this big microphone hanging above the girls, and we'd be like, no, that would really impact what they're going to talk about in the sessions, and the but them actually being kind of themselves, because there's this massive equipment all over the place. So we then had to kind of look for alternatives, what's less disruptive in the space, what can kind of keep the space safe. So that was really important for us to be able to be heard and trust them to trust our kind of experience and expertise. And even when it comes to the editing process, we were really heavily involved in the actual editing, and kind of had a lot of control over like what the final narrative is going to be. And I think that was really important for us, because when you think about the portrayal of Muslim women and girls, it is almost always so problematic. It's almost like never actually coming from Muslim women themselves, and it's just such a minefield to get it wrong. And I think that's when you work with marginalized communities, it is really important to actually, like Raheel said, let go of power and let their voices and opinions come through. And
lots of interesting things to think about there, I think, for people behind the camera as well. Which will be interesting for our audience of young filmmakers, I think, who are thinking about starting in film or, making their first films. Sarah, I wonder, you've worked with some really big films actually, or films that have maybe started off as activist films and then become really big mainstream successes. Maybe do you want to talk about what it is that's, you know, what filmmakers can do in order to have a bigger impact, given that impact is such a big sort of thing for activist filmmakers.
Yeah, so just also to completely agree on everything that the previous two speakers have said, because it's so important, this idea of working with the community. So all the work that we kind of work on, we're looking at different social issues from different lenses, and the majority of my job is listening. It's kind of going into a community who've been impacted by a certain issue and hearing what are the things that are sort of important and relevant in that moment, and how can we help amplify that to an audience, especially because so many films are sort of made over a multiple year period. So some projects might be made if we're doing a feature documentary, for example, it might be 3 years, 4 years of production. And so when a film comes out, which is when we get mostly involved, we kind of run what are called impact distribution campaigns. So it's bringing a film out into the world that wants to make impact. I'm trying to consider what's most important now that's going to help this particular community to achieve the goals that they have. So when we look at sort of an impact campaign, and I've been really blessed to work on the projects that I have, and I think kind of there's no like magic bullet that will make your film be like the one that goes on to be nominated for an Oscar or go to the BAFTAs. It's a combination of sometimes like 20, 30, 40 people working on a project together. So I truly am blessed to have that opportunity. But the first thing that we speak with our filmmakers about is about intention, and what were the objectives you had in making this project. So for some of them, they'll explicitly say, like, the reason I made this film is because I wanted to drive donations towards this particular organisation that I'm working with. I want to kind of directly help them financially. If the film can become really well known, then there could be a donation portal and kind of do direct support there. So one of the things when I came on board to help give some structure around the Action for Sama campaign, it was completely Wad's idea. So for anyone who's seen For Sama, you'll know what an incredible human the director Wad Akateb is. And it was her vision, it was her ideas, it was kind of everything that she wanted to do. And so it was kind of then helping to frame, okay, what are your objectives and how can we help that be realised? So putting together sort of a website that could drive people towards a donation portal. Another thing that she was really passionate about was providing more empathy for people who are living in the UK who have been affected by the Syrian regime. So if you haven't seen the film, you should still be able to watch it on Channel 4 kind of online. So there's a number of kind of elements of stigma around people from Syria who are living in the UK. And so part of the campaign was to kind of invigorate positive kind of viewpoints of people living in the UK and show the realities on the ground of why they had left to come over. So this is simple things like having a blog on the website talking about the issues on the ground. During the Christmas and New Year period this year, there were multiple bombings of hospitals and maternity wards. And so looking at what was the kind of factual information that could be presented to audiences that would translate some of these very, very complicated sort of human rights abuses at scale into tangible things that audiences could kind of understand. And so making sure that we were putting out communications, putting out press sort of awareness moments that would provide a base of understanding for audiences onto the current conversation. And when you have an opportunity to work on a project that can potentially become Oscar nominated or BAFTA nominated, you have this platform for then providing sort of an incredible reach with these issues. So a previous project we worked on as well was a film called The Hunting Ground. And I wasn't responsible for this thing I'm about to say now, but I love that I was just a part of a team that did this. The film soundtrack song that was made by Lady Gaga, it was a film about sexual assault. They managed to get 50 survivors of sexual assault to perform at the Oscars on stage. So if you watch the Oscars 4 seasons ago, her title track that she performed, there were 50 survivors on stage with her. And it was essentially a song declaring that we are a survivor of sexual assault and our voices matter. And so getting the nomination and getting to that platform was really, really important. But it was actually like, what can we do for the community when we have the space to have that platform? And I think that was a really good example of sort of the team that was really led by the US team who put together that amazing moment. But Wad also for Sama brought that in. It was the highest winning film at the BFIs last year. They won 4 awards for the film. And every time in the celebration of like picking up that award, she was referencing like, thank you to kind of my community at home. I'm doing this for kind of my community. It's always pushing back to the community you're serving. So we kind of start all of our work on what is this objective, what is this intent, and then trying to build that through. So sometimes our films stay down here, sometimes we have the luck and just fate of the world that they come up here, and every time it's like, how can we direct action back to the community that we're trying to help?
Super. That's obviously, it's interesting because you're talking about instances now, I think, where you've got where there's access to really fantastic resources, people like Lady Gaga. But a lot of filmmakers, especially at the beginning, will be at the other end of the filmmaking industry, so scrambling around for whatever they can cobble together to make a film. It's how I make lots of stuff. I just wanted to talk about that side of things a bit more. I mean, maybe coming back to Anna, but also, I mean, if any of you would like to say anything about that, really, the idea that one of the powerful things I think about films is that you don't actually need that much to make a film. Yeah, I don't know who wants to pick that. Anna, do you want to pick that up? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, like picking up on what we talked about earlier, that it's no matter what you do, it's always really important, I think, that you think about where you place yourself in the film and who you are to tell the story. And I think especially when it comes to these kind of subjects and when it comes to activism in film. And I think, I mean, especially also for myself, because I know that I am white and I'm privileged and I'm from the West, and I sit here in my safe zone and I look at something happening to other people outside in the world, which was like one of the things that I kind of like tried to address in the film and work with that kind of contrast, because what social media has done to the world now is that it's a world society we're in, and we can actually do a lot together, and we can reach each other in new ways, and we can get an insight to something very quickly. Suddenly, it's not only the news perspective on things, it's actually people being there. And I think when you make these kinds of films, it's really important that you think about where you place yourself in that and why you want to make it. Because you can't like, who am I to tell how it is to be a woman in Iraq? I'm not, but I can kind of like use myself to get more insight about that, and hopefully in that sense, in my own way of trying to understand what that is, give a bigger understanding to some people, if you get my point.
Yeah, I just was wondering about, just in terms of that, you know, that's sort of about your position in relation to film. Film is always, there's a lot of power when you're behind a camera or on a computer screen, bringing together a narrative. You're the storyteller, and that's sort of almost inevitable. I think what's interesting, also talking with Raheel and Alaa, is about this idea of participation, where more people are telling the story, and it's a really difficult thing, isn't it, in those collaborations? I wonder whether you want to talk a bit about the challenges, Raheel or Alaa, either of you, really.
Yeah, I mean, Nala, you can go. You can, yeah. So, I mean, one of our projects is around the disproportionate number of Muslim men in prison. So, just a couple of figures: the number of Black and brown people in prison, they make up 27% of the prison population. Those stories aren't really heard, or not from them directly anyway. And when we first started, it would be myself and a couple of guys who had been through the prison system. So immediately, because there were, you know, and I'm a Muslim man, so talking to other Muslim men, that immediately created a sense of trust. But what was also really interesting was, in prison, like, violence is normalized. So you would hear somebody say, oh yeah, I wasn't allowed to pray on a particular day. Now, when I heard that, I didn't just have a kind of intellectual reaction to that, I had a bodily reaction to that. If it had been a white researcher going in, hearing that story, they might have been like, oh, okay, you know, like, let's move on. But because it was me with a couple of my team who had been through the prison system, you know, we were able to make something really powerful out of that one event. And, you know, we've now presented that story frequently to ministers as well. And there has been an addition to a race review that's going through government right now. So we took that story travelled, you know, from Leicester in a really like rubbishy room where we had not great recording equipment. It was like phones and stuff, and has been placed in front of the minister, who's been like, oh my God, I didn't know that was happening. And I think that it goes back to the idea of stories, because, you know, if you're trying to make change and you want government to do something different, they get loads of data, but every time I've seen a minister or a civil servant like really take notice is if they hear a particular story. That's the thing that kind of really gets them, I think. Yeah, but it's a really, I think we've always done it as an organisation. We've always had this kind of like, you have, you know, the more kind of eclectic and kind of different the network of people working on something, I think the more interesting the output will be.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's really powerful, isn't it? The fact that it's just that's the sort of essence of storytelling, really, that this tiny detail is the key to understanding it, and somehow that travels, and that's something that's universal. We can all understand that example, and a minister can understand that, and I think that is really something for filmmakers to look for, isn't it, when you're engaging in an issue or as a filmmaker.
And can I just to add on, I just want to say, like, you know, I think it's also just, you know, for the Black and brown filmmakers, or, you know, filmmakers from other marginalized communities, like, don't, you know, I would say, like, it's really easy to sort of like brush away your kind of heritage and think like you've got to fit into a particular mold. And I would say the fact that you don't fit into a mold will be the kind of thing that is a real strength, but it can just seem harder sometimes to like really believe in that, because there are so many things that might be, you know, going against you.
And so many, you will have been told so many times to the contrary in subtle ways, I think.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you want to add anything in that respect?
Yeah, I think just picking up on Raheel's point, this idea of, like, we get told all the time, like, that a picture can say 1,000 words, and it's so true. So an example that we had a few years ago with Unrest, which was a film about chronic fatigue syndrome, it's a really misunderstood part of medicine and science, and 89% of people diagnosed are women. And there is a correlation between those two things, that because it affected more women, historically, people would brush it off as being, oh, you're just depressed, or you're tired, or it would always be brushed off, and it was actually a kind of medical diagnosis. And we were working in really close collaboration with charities in the UK who were fighting for more research funding for this issue. And one of our team members who was working on the project, LaCie, pulled together this incredible moment in Parliament where we brought together MPs into a room and we screened 20 minutes of this feature. You can't get MPs in a room for long periods of time. It's quite hard. So we screened 20 minutes of film, and then we gave space immediately for the charities and the researchers working on the day-to-day of this issue to then talk and speak to ministers. So the invitation of saying, would you like to come to a lunchtime film screening, see this film that's been at Sundance, come and have a dialogue. But actually the reason of getting in the room was to allow space for the charities and the researchers working on the issue to actually deliver stuff to the people in the space. Because the research and the evidence they had say that they needed more funding for this issue, that they needed guidelines to be changed in terms of how the medical community dealt with this particular issue. They'd been saying it loudly for a long time, but not really feel listening to. And LaCie was amazing at, like, pulling together this list of MPs in the room. We had 55 members of Parliament at this briefing, and the most they'd ever managed to get before on this particular issue was 5 in a room at the same time. So the film, we see this a lot of the times, like, the film is the gateway into having engagement in a bigger way, and actually then giving space to people who are the experts on this conversation, which is a really, really important thing. And we're doing this now with Coded Bias, which is an incredibly powerful film looking at the bias inherently in some technology, and what that can do and lead to if gone unchecked. So this comes into issues of employment, kind of issues of just their entire lives are run by technology. So the technology is inherently biased or racist or sexist in any way, it can have really, really bad effects. So we've started conversations with leading organizations in the US who are fighting kind of against policies on facial recognition and kind of technology like that, to try and get the film into spaces, for example, with members of Congress, with members of Parliament, and then bring in those people who are saying, actually, this technology is really bad and we want to change the law. So the film is a sort of catalyst moment for understanding, but it's actually allowing the conversation of the experts to come into space. And I just want to also add, because I'm putting it into the chat as well, I would love everyone who's listening in to introduce themselves. I think these moments are really, really important, and to kind of know who's in the room. And if you're making impact films, it would be great if you introduce yourself in the chat, because it would be wonderful to know what issues you're working on, in case any on the panel can give any advice while we're here. So make the most of the fact that you have a room of people that can give you advice in the chat.
So I'm just unmuting myself here. Just wanted to talk about challenges. You know, making films that engage with political, social issues. Making films with in marginalised communities can bring its own challenges beyond the challenges of representation, which we were just talking about in a practical sense. Alaa, do you want to talk a bit about that in relation to your work and the projects you've been on?
I think, so kind of carrying on from what Sarah has been talking about, we also kind of try and use the film in a similar way to screen it, especially within kind of CEOs and big decision makers within the sports sector, because when you look at kind of the percentages of communities who are physically active, it's usually women of Muslim background, and particularly kind of South Asian backgrounds that are actually don't have a lot of access to ways to be physically active. And the way the sports sector has always kind of framed it was, these communities are hard to reach, they are very hard to engage with, and it's just something that's on them, why they're not physically active. And we kind of try and use the film as a way to screen it, and then have sort of panel discussions like we're having now to talk about, actually, you know, you are hard to reach, and the sports sector is not catering to all people. You're actually catering to a very specific set of people, and you need to kind of flip your thinking. And the girls, that they're all about 12 to 13 years old in the film, so they're speaking very candidly, very unfiltered about their experiences of racism within schools, of kind of sexism within the PE department, within just kind of also from their own peers, from boys telling them, oh, why don't you go home, why don't you why are you playing sports? And kind of that really real, authentic, and sometimes funny moments in the film can kind of start these conversations within people who kind of maybe wouldn't have had any access to these communities, and really kind of no understanding. So that's kind of our hope, is to try and challenge it that way. But in terms of challenges we face, is that especially when it comes to the public narrative around Muslim girls, it's so kind of deep within society and kind of embedded in a lot of people's mindsets, is that even though they're seeing the film, they still kind of latch on to, like, but how can I twist it to still make it ask about girls being oppressed and whatever, even though that's actually not in the film at all. But we often get people asking, well, but what about their dads and their brothers? Did they allow them to take part? And kind of this narrative of the oppressed at home, that their fathers are oppressive. And even though there's kind of no evidence of that in anything that the girls actually said themselves. And I think that's kind of the challenge, is that even though you're trying to change the narrative, it will still seep through people's minds. And I think it's out on us to then kind of challenge it back, or kind of shut it down, so it doesn't kind of derail from what the girls are saying and from what the film is trying to say.
Yeah, those are interesting points, I think. I wonder whether, Anna, if you are working on something else now, whether are you still using these same techniques of you know, filming people down the line, you know, filming people on Skype or WhatsApp, or, you know, using these kind of sort of roots activist kind of techniques?
I'm actually working on something completely different right now. But the idea before COVID-19 happened was for me to go to Kurdistan and make a film about one of the contributors in the film. But that obviously is holding back right now because, because the whole world happened to have a pandemic. So right now I'm working on a film about my family, which is very, very different. I would say what I found really inspiring being in lockdown was that all these protests about Black Lives Matter happened, and in that process I actually started collecting material again. But yeah, I never took it further than that.
So sort of archiving from online content, I guess, which is something that it's really interesting, I think, to think about as filmmakers. You know, what resources can you use? What have you got if you haven't got a lot? And I keep coming back to this point, but I think that it's useful when you're starting out and you don't have access to huge pots of money and ways.
And I think for me, what is really interesting is how, especially on Instagram, how people use their stories and how you can, you know, find all of these really inspiring people, and you can follow them on the streets in the moment where things are actually happening, and you can get so much closer to, like, especially, I mean, some of these protests was really violent, but you didn't necessarily see that in the news because it's difficult for the news to get that close to what is the truth of what's happening. But you suddenly just have like that insight on your phone very easily, and it gives you a much stronger picture of what's going on. And I don't know why, but I think I just keep recording those things because it's just such a strong insight of things, and it's not necessarily to make it a film in the end, but it's also just because it's such a short moment, and it's gonna disappear again when people put them into their stories. But it's so it's so powerful, I think.
I just wanted to pick up on that a little bit from Anna, that I find it's like a really exciting time at the moment, that like any of you can now be a storyteller. It could not be easier if you have access to a mobile phone to be filming stuff. You could be capturing stuff in real time, as Anna was saying, you're posting stuff in real time. And if you consider like how lucky you are now to be in a position where you can film, edit, kind of add captions on your phone, post in real time to an audience, for free, access millions of people around the world if you wanted to. There's such a lower barrier to entry in terms of making a mark, in terms of activist filmmaking and sharing what's happening around the world. And like Anna's film is literally evidence to this. Like, you were following essentially kind of women who were telling their own stories in real time and gaining momentum. Everyone in the audience has the opportunity to do that. And one kind of person I'd encourage people to have a look at, two of our friends who were profiling in our webinar series in a couple of weeks, Jack Harries and LaCie, they just launched a new platform called Earthrise Studio on Instagram, and it's specifically calling out the climate crisis. It's showcasing voices from millennial generations, Gen Z generations, whatever name people want to have at the moment, but it's really just collecting like stories from around the world of young people who are really passionate about the climate crisis and want to talk about it. And they've been really fortunate through their work to end up making the behind the scenes film with the new David Attenborough project, which launched on Netflix a few days ago. Like, they've managed to take it to like an incredible position. But Jack started with a YouTube channel like 8 years ago and just kept making content. So if you guys are passionate about certain stories and you really want to talk about something, this idea of like creating what you think is important to you, putting it out on different platforms. Are you the Instagram person? Are you a YouTuber? Like, it doesn't matter the platform now, just making content that's really authentic and true to that vision. And eventually you might be making the behind the scenes film with David Attenborough. Like, that could be you in 8 years' time. But having that conviction to put it out there. And I think that like, I don't think I'm old, but like compared to sort of like where I was when I joined the industry and none of these things were available, kind of be able to do that in real time, you guys have such an amazing opportunity in the audience to like go and make your mark and put out your own stories. So like be brave and do it, like go and do it today. Go and post that thing that you've been sitting on your hard drive for a year, like put it out there, and you never know if someone's going to relate to it and want to sort of watch it.
Great. I wanted to come back to the idea of like how you get stuff seen by the people that you want to see it. Raheel, do you at Maslaha, for example, in the kind of projects that you're doing, what's the like circulation of what you're doing like of the films that you're making with people?
So there are kind of different audiences for the different films. So I think we try and go like using social media, but also, like as Alaa was saying, if we're creating a film about what seems to be about Muslim girls learning fencing, but through that, like challenging some of the stereotypes around them, then there's a kind of whole sports sector that we can really kind of like address in that. But also, I think, but us, it's about what we're trying to do is open up space. So we're doing a partnership with the British Library next year. Not everyone goes to the British Library, and we're really keen to see if we can open up a space that might not be so inviting to lots of the communities that we work with, and that will be about programming. But also what we try and do is actually go into where people are, like where they live. So and try and hold kind of screenings in those spaces as well. So I think it's kind of being about disruptive, like being disruptive in spaces that aren't normally screening films on Islamophobia, for instance. But then also kind of recognizing that there are kind of centers of like knowledge and like kind of almost like informal creative arts knowledge spaces within communities. And it might just be one single room, but that's actually a space where you could hold a screening, and you could have 100 people there that in that night. And I think our range of people that we kind of work with is, so we're working with primary schools around the country, but we're also working with people in their 60s as well. So that's a really nice kind of generational gap to kind of bring together.
And do you find that film is something, it's this thing that all of these generations can engage with in a way? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think film, and I think it's just when people hear stories in languages or in kind of expressions that they recognize from other people who are from their community, it just immediately kind of, it's a way of like building a bridge and a trust, and then people are like comfortable and they're like, okay, I want to hear more. But I think it is that thing of so we're working with loads of community researchers at the moment, recording the impact of COVID in Nørager, and the researchers are from those communities. Like Sarah's saying, there is so much to record right now, and this is also an archive, like as you were saying, Anna. Like this will be really important material, like in 2 years now, or like 20 years from now, people are going to be looking back and thinking what was kind of going on. So it's really important that people from those communities are recording those stories themselves.
I think that's something else that we haven't really talked about it here, but this idea, and it's sort of growing, I think, and it's related to representation, the idea that your own story, and either you should, if you can, and if you're inclined to do it, start with yourself, or come back to it. I mean, you don't have to start with it, but in like Anna, now you're filming your family. I think that there's that's really important, especially important in communities that are underrepresented. But that also, you have a lot of material that you might not realise. You have photographs, you might have things recorded on your phone. All of that is material to make a film with, and films are being made with less. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything about that.
I would say that people, like our families or individuals or kind of like our elders, they're like our libraries, right? And so it is. I think it's really important right now to hear their stories, because I think those stories don't always necessarily just come out like freely, you kind of almost have to like, right, tell me how you arrived in this country, like what was the first jobs that you were doing, you know? And I was just reading this really, really great article by Ashley Clark in the BFI magazine about films that were being made by Black filmmakers like Horace Ovey in the 70s, around Black activism. And you don't know, you know, I've only found out about that in this past week because there's a whole bunch of stuff around Steve McQueen and Mangrove. But, you know, I think it's, yeah, you're right. It's like really recording those stories now. And then there are kind of, they will then become our archives, and we, you know, we have control of our own archives, because I think that's the other thing that happens when you're from marginalized communities. Your history is deliberately kind of cut away from you. You become this one moment in time, whereas actually our history has a long tail going back, and we can both learn from that and also understand, you know, why some of the inequalities or racism or homophobia that we face right now has this really long history. It didn't just happen over a past week. So I think that archiving thing is really important.
Yeah, important. And also I think sometimes filmmakers stumble at this, at thinking, oh, it's not interesting, or it's not really a story. And that you can, I mean, just incredible films have come out of these tiny, what seemed like tiny stories, I think.
Yeah.
Anna, how are you finding it filming with your family?
That's a very different story. That's definitely the most difficult thing I've had to do so far. But just like, I just have a small thing, just coming back to this archive, because what I also realized through this process of making Follow Me is that one of the, like, some of the strongest moments in the film, what I think is some of the strongest moments in the film, is just like these small voice messages coming from some of the girls, just in the moment of like when things are happening, because we are constantly in contact, and when you are, sorry
to interrupt you, how are they sending them, just if you can?
Just a normal voice message. I've always felt quite socially awkward on social media, and I've never sent anyone voice messages, but getting to know all of these women, I kind of like had to go into it the same way that they did, and it was a really really good experience. But also suddenly you're just having these conversations just constantly going on your phone, because you keep sending voice messages back and forth, and you sort of feel like you're with them in the situation that they're in, and you know, if you go back before we had like social media and all of these things, you went out with a camera and you went home and you had rushes. But now you can collect from so many places, and you don't have to look at an interview, be like, now we set up this situation and we have an interview. You can actually, you know, collect all these bits and pieces just from your phone, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Just to add to that as well, there's been such a rise in documentary podcasting over the last few years as well. So we work with NYC, which is the biggest documentary festival in North America, and as part of the industry programming, we started last year and this year doing a focus on documentary podcasting, because I think we always want to come at it from what's the best version of that story to be told. So if it is the audio is actually really compelling, and you've got this amazing, like, I don't know, a cassette tape from the 50s of like something amazing that happened, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a film. It could be a really incredible podcast or a series of podcasts around it. And so looking at the form that makes sense for your story is really important. And I had this quite a lot, because we worked on VR kind of a bit. We Unrest had a VR accompanying piece that was supported by the BFI to tour across the UK, and loads of people came to me afterwards and were like, I've got a really great idea for a VR project, it's going to be amazing in VR. My first question was like, is that the right medium for this story? VR might sound really cool and awesome, and maybe at some point you might get more money for it from certain partners, but is it actually the best way to tell that story? And most of the time it wasn't. It was like they thought it sounded really cool, and like maybe it could be more empathetic, because if I could get inside the head of like in a refugee camp and it would work and it'd be there. And it's like, okay, yes, in some moments and instances that could be a really powerful thing to do, but don't start with, I want to make VR, and I'm going to like force the subject into that. But if you've got this really incredible like voice kind of conversation with someone, if you've got this really amazing audio, then maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's a short form, maybe like Twitter added an audio post function like a couple of months ago. Maybe you do like an epic Twitter thread and it's all audio pieces. Like the construction of what we term a documentary to be now is so different. And obviously I'm talking from a documentary point of view, but some people in the audience are also fiction. But not always thinking like it has to be a film, I think is really important, especially when you're talking about social issue work, because making a film is a long process, like pre-production, filming, post-production, getting all the clearances out there. And actually for some of you, if it's more urgent work and it's like the subject's really volatile right now, maybe it's a quick podcast and you put it together really quickly and you publish it and it becomes something else sort of later. So I love this idea for Anna that you had so much different mixed media in there. That was so clever how you did it, because it was really using all these different forms to put together a really compelling, like I was so moved by your film, and it was using all these different forms of media that wouldn't have been apparent in a film a few years ago. So don't ever be like constricted by thinking I've got to make this big feature film. It could be something really small or really unique, and also using these different mixed media messages at the same time can be really, really helpful.
Great. I think we're just about the right moment to move to some questions from our audience. We've got loads of questions coming in, so I'll just share them out to our panel, if that's all right. So from Molly, oh actually, sorry, let me start with this question from Nella. How do you build an honest and open relationship with your participants when directing a sensitive topic? Maybe Alaa, do you want to take that one?
I think if you're kind of coming in as a filmmaker and there isn't much of a previous relationship there, and especially if you're kind of not of the community you're documenting, it's a lot of work that has to go into trust building, and it's not going to you're not going to just pop in and everyone's going to open up and trust you. And I think it's really important to then maybe like slowly develop a relationship, and also come in without an agenda, come in kind of just listening, hearing people, not necessarily thinking about like, oh, this is going to be a great clip and this is going to be like a great sound piece and we could do that. Just kind of like just let the moment flow and let them take over. And I think for us it was just like meeting after meeting and really kind of developing trust before we even got to the room. And even when you're then in there, kind of maybe get people, how we were kind of as facilitators in the room to really kind of get someone who can challenge you, I guess, because there would have been otherwise things happening that would have changed the dynamic. And essentially, like for example, the big microphone, or having a huge crew in the room with a group of kind of teenage girls, and that would have changed what they're actually documenting and changed the kind of truthfulness of it compared to when they're not in the room. So I think maybe get people who and kind of make yourself known that it's okay to be challenged as the filmmaker. And especially if you're not of the community, kind of how Raheel said, like be willing to take a step back and just listen.
Really great points there. Okay, question from Molly now. Do you think the era of social media helps or hinders documentary filmmaking, for example, researching an events and attempting to gain reliable sources and evidence from platforms such as YouTube and Twitter? Anna, what would you say?
I think it brings new possibilities. And if you look at it with a more creative, open mind, instead of think that films has to be made in a specific way, then I think you can discover so much. Not only is it a different insight to what is happening, and it gives you access to something that you wouldn't necessarily have had access to, but it can also bring so much more to your storytelling. So it's it gives you, I think it gives you more in both ways.
So would you maybe add something to that as well?
I think it's, yeah, I think it's right. What I said. Yeah.
I was just going to come in and say, so Mark Cousins' new documentary about women in film, he said he did most of that online because he couldn't go anywhere. And I think I loved his approach, which was basically, he's like managed to record women filmmakers from Japan, from Malaysia, from the Soviet Union, and his approach was, were there great women filmmakers in those countries? They're there, they just haven't been honoured. So it's up to me to find them. And I think that that seemed to work really, really well.
Yeah, but it's a resource, isn't it? It's a fantastic resource as well for filmmakers. It's bottomless, almost. There's a question here from Theodore. Were there any hindrances in making your first film, and how did you overcome them? Anna, is this your first film?
It's not my first film, but it's my
your first film, because I think for first-time filmmakers, it's the first film is so hard, isn't it? What kind of hindrances and things did you face?
I mean, I would say, but I think that's also because I'm still a student at the National Film and Television School, and I think a big part of the process, and it's something that I'm still trying to figure out because it's just really difficult, but it is why I want to tell the stories that I want to tell, because going into that, it also makes you think about who you are as a director, and again, going back to where you place yourself. And I think what happened to me at the NFTs is that I started, not on purpose, but I started putting myself in the film as well. And I found that very difficult and overwhelming, but I've also learned a lot from that. And I think it's very important, at least for me, because it gives me so much perspective on the things that I'm doing. And in a way, in the end, it also makes the idea of what I want to do so much more clear, because it all goes back to what and why, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Sure, I just wonder, but just also in terms of that's a struggle. That's a sort of a struggle of the filmmaker. But it's in terms of sort of like practical things. Did you struggle? I remember when I made my first film, I didn't. I used to like overshoot. That was like my biggest problem when I first started filming, which is like, you think it sounds like it's a sort of innocent mistake, but it basically means that you also like run everyone working with you into the ground, and then you interview people for sort of 3 hours at the time until they can't speak anymore. They're just like begging to be let out of the room. You're like, no, one more question. And I'm just wondering about these kinds of things that you sort of learn along the way that are useful tips for sort of people starting out and in film.
Yeah, I think, so I have a background in TV, and I've done a couple of documentary series, but I think what I have with me from the Danish School of Journalism is that you learn how to be very specific about what you're doing, and you learn quite quickly how to make a scene, how to set it up, and how to make a payoff on the scene. And that is really useful when you go out and you shoot documentaries, because it makes you a lot more clear about what you're filming. So I don't really have that problem, but I think what I really needed to push away was the way that I interview people, because what you learn in TV is that it's very important that you are not there and that they have the question within the answer. And I really needed to let go of that and just have like a conversation. And I think that's also what you see in Follow Me, is that obviously it's an interview, but I also let myself be in a conversation, and it's okay that, you know, I bring myself into it and I make mistakes or whatever. Maybe their answers is not necessarily that clear, but at least they feel more truth and authentic, because I don't ask them to answer it again and again to get a more and more clear answer. So that's like some of those things. Yeah.
Okay.
Add on to that just like a little bit in terms of a lot of the challenges. So I used to work for a film fund before I started together films, and so we're constantly meeting like first time filmmakers and working to see kind of how we can support them. As if you don't know, Doc Society, that's a funder in the UK. They have a fund, they support short film work, and they support a lot of first time filmmakers. Obviously your topic's got to be amazing, but everyone can apply, so like you can always apply for that funding. One of the things I normally say to people who are trying to start out is like, be as prepared as you can be. So to Anna's point, like you can do as much research as you can in advance, but when you're in that room with someone, you're interviewing them, something will change, something will go wrong, the LaCie won't work as you want to, or the question, the answer isn't what you want it to be. But as long as you can walk into the space as prepared as you can, then you've done your homework, you've like prepared as much as you can. And I'd say the same thing is like building your network in the industry. So I've been frantically chatting away with everybody, and you can see my eyes glaring as I'm typing during the panel, but a lot of people struggle to like introduce themselves. So in every panel I'm now doing moving forward, I'm actively saying to the audience, like, say hello in the chat. Because when I moved to London, I didn't know a single person in film. I didn't have any connections. I'm from a middle to lower kind of income background. I had no sort of support network to like give me a job in film. And it was just by being a nice human, introducing myself to people, building a network is how you build your sort of space in film. So any one of these moments, it just seems like a Zoom chat is so simple. But now I think I've answered 25 of you during the middle of that conversation. There are maybe 25 people in the room that you might want to work with who could support your work. So every time you have the opportunity to be in a space where you can say, hey, this is what I'm working on, I'm really passionate about, from in the chat, we've got climate crisis, we've got fast fashion, we've got refugee crisis, we've got trans identity in India, we've got mental health. There are so many amazing projects people want to make. And you might have this person in the conversation with you right now in the chat who might say, hey, actually, I'd love to help you make that happen. So be as prepared as you can be with your own research, be as prepared as you can be in terms of how to present yourself. And a Zoom chat is a really good like version of it. It's like, it's 2 sentences. What are you working on? But no one asked you at the beginning, no one answered. He asked again, no one answered. And I'm like, right, I'm going to come in here and like get you talking. And actually you may all now find collaborators from the simple notion of a chat window in a webinar. So always, always, always like have your 2 sentences ready. So when someone says to you, like, what are you working on? I'm really passionate about this theme and I'm making a documentary on it, or I'm making a podcast. Introduce your idea, because you never know who's in the audience who might be able to support you and kind of help that make it happen.
Great. A question for Raheel. What's the value in creating work in participation and collaboration with communities, rather than treating them merely as subjects?
Wow, that's. I mean, I think for me, you know, there's something. It feels wrong to go in, even with the idea that communities will just be subjects. It just doesn't feel physically. I think I would end up like exploding or something. It just couldn't work. But I think what it allows is your idea for whatever the film that you're making to sort of like suddenly grow and have so many different tangents that you just didn't think you didn't have originally planned, and so many different ideas as well. It just also makes it just more, there's a kind of truthfulness, and authenticity is a word that people use a lot, but it just makes that far more authentic. And then I think the other thing that we try to do is that if we're working with communities, what is that idea of like not just extracting knowledge, but how can they then also benefit from that film that you've made. So if you know, when we made our Talking from the Heart, which is our mental health film, we worked with a Somali women's group called Medea, and we constantly platform Medea in all of our events. I know Muslim Girls Fence team are doing exactly the same thing. So it's not just about making the film, but like as Sarah is saying, actually, once these become part of your family, you know, so they're always there. they're kind of like family, your network. So it's about almost like a learning community that can always support each other.
Yeah, that's a nice idea as well, isn't it? That you become a community as well within that process. This is a question which I'd sort of throw out to whoever wants to take it, I think. It's a question here from Betty. When there's so many really important issues and injustices around the world that we may hold really dear and that need addressing, how do we deliberate where to start and what battles to begin fighting? How do we get audiences behind these projects? And how do you safeguard your own mental health when dealing with these hard-hitting issues? Who wants a shot?
I can do a little bit on it, and then probably I think the other two are about to say something as well. So just very quickly, the mental health issue in our sector has become so important. Today is World Mental Health Day. It's really important that we focus on that. I put in the chat as well, I'm what we would call a high functioning person with depression and anxiety. I'm like very confident now. I can have some days where I don't get out of bed. Like everyone has mental health things that they are dealing with, but the pressures, especially on social impact filmmakers, is like 10 times that effect. So there's an amazing person in our network that we love called Rebecca Day, who has started a project called Film in Mind. And she's specifically a therapist that works with people in the film space who are dealing with the pressures of making films and the pressure that come with that process, but especially also social impact films, because you're a lot of the times taking the burden of some really, really serious issues on your shoulders. So working on projects around sexual assault, around the refugee crisis, around the climate crisis, it can be quite an overwhelming day-to-day life when you're having to deal with that every day. So if you haven't heard of Rebecca's work, Film in Mind, definitely go and check that out. She's encouraging that film funders put a budget line in for therapeutic support for those who are dealing with these pressures and a production. So making sure that if you're the director or you're any project kind of person working on these issues, to raise your voice if you're feeling like it's too overwhelming, to make sure there's a supportive network around you so that your friends and family know the kind of film you're making. It can be a very isolating process making a project, especially a kind of low budget project, one of your first films. If you're spending all of your days looking at material that can be quite difficult, make sure your friends and family know that's what you're doing, because it can have a really massive impact on your mental health personally, and if no one else knows you're going through that, like they might not know how to help you. So check out Rebecca's work and do kind of talk with your production team about it. And the mental health aspect also relates to your subjects. So the subject in the film, it can be life-changing if your life is suddenly in the public domain. So please be really, really respectful and work with your subjects to make sure that they also have the mental health support that they need, because it can be really freaky if suddenly everybody knows who you are, everybody knows the history of your family and what you've been through. So making sure that you're being supportive and protective there. And my kind of final thing on, we get approached by different filmmakers throughout the year, and there are so many things in the world that we could be highlighting through our work. So we try and make sure that we're focusing on what we think from our view of the world in the moment, what are maybe the sort of 3 or 4 issues that we can mentally and physically handle in that moment, that we think are the most important issues from what we're seeing. So coded bias as an example, the kind of the effect of bias in technology is having massive impacts around the world. If you look at the elections on November 3rd, like if technology is not checked up on, it can have massive impact. So we try and look on a yearly basis, what are the 3 or 4 themes that we think are most pertinent, and try and work on projects in that light. And it's a very personal thing though. If you think for you it's the climate crisis or sustainability, whatever it might be, like make sure it's the project that means that you want to be working out the whole time, because it's not easy work and it's really long hours and you'll be like, oh my God, it's really stressful. So you have to be really passionate on that subject to get you through those hours. So.
Lovely. That's really, really important advice. I think that's all we've got time for. Actually, we've come to the end of the discussion time, so I'm going to hand over to Alex. But I want to say thanks so much to all of our panelists. It was a really interesting discussion. I think at a time where we need people to filmmakers to think about how they can engage in issues and movements. I think some really useful points. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, panelists. That was amazing. Thank you, everyone, for so many insightful questions, and also for sharing your projects with us in the chat. That's really, really interesting to hear what you guys are working on. I know you're all waiting to find out who the winner of the competition is, but I'm just going to announce a couple of other things first. And if you want to take that time to copy and paste anything from the chat, because I know the panelists shared some amazing links with you, then do that now. First thing I was going to say is that after this event ends, you guys will receive an email from Eventbrite with a link to a short survey. It would be amazing if you could take a few minutes to just help us tell us what you thought of today's session and kind of what you would like to see us cover in our upcoming sessions. We do look at all the feedback, so it will not be wasted. It will only take a few minutes of your time. And I also wanted to let you know that we have a number of events coming up today. So for our Film Academy delegates, we have 2 hotspots. At 4 p.m, we have a hotspot with Kathy Brady, whose debut feature Wildfire premieres tonight at the London Film Festival on the BFI player at 8:30 p.m. And at 8 p.m, we have a hotspot with Jennifer Sheridan, whose debut feature Rose a Love Story premieres at LFF next week. So that's for all our Film Academy delegates. You should have received an email from us last week with the registration link and the password to join those events, and you can still register for them. So do that now if you want to attend those. And then for everyone, we have a free panel discussion at 6 p.m. on immersive storytelling. And it is particularly focused on 2 projects in our LFF expanded exhibition, LFL and To Miss a Thing. Noel will post the link to that Eventbrite registration page shortly, if he hasn't already. So you guys can still register for that event. It's free to attend. And if you're not able to attend any of those events, we will be recording all of them, and they will be posted on the BFI YouTube channel after the festival. So you'll still have an opportunity to see them. So for the winner of the LaCie competition, if I call out your name, if you hear your name called out, please type here in the chat box. I'll give you a few seconds to respond. If you're not around, I'll move on to calling another name. So make sure you're ready and be quick. So the winner of the LaCie Rugged 2 terabyte hard drive is Theodore Kolarov. Theodore, are you around? Here, amazing. Congratulations, Theodore. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will be in touch next week about mailing your hard drive. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you again, the panelists and Anna, our host. You are amazing. And see you everyone at 4 p.m. for the hotspot with Kathy Brady. Have a lovely day. Bye.